Great. As I said, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the global launch of the report into the Citizens Assembly on Trade and Climate Change. It took place in June and July of last year, and we've now got through to the phase of having written it up into a full report, and which we're here to present to you today. Before we do that, I'll give Liam and Susan the opportunity to introduce themselves, and then I will show a very short 1 minute video with some of which is kind of a trailer video for the project, if you like. So to start off with, I'll just go to you, Liam, and then to Susan, and then I'll show the video.
Hello, my name's Liam Campling. I'll be talking. I'm based at Queen Mary, University of London, where I'm Professor of International Business and Development, and I'll be talking to you in a bit. Pass over to Susan.
Hi, I'm Susan Ritchie, and lovely to see some of the Assembly members on the call. I'm Director of Mutual Gain, and I'll be talking to you. I'll answer any questions you've got about the Assembly.
Fantastic. And so now it falls. Rather than go through the process of trying to play the video, I think we should just go straight into the presentation because I'm not exactly sure what the problem is. If it's all right, Liam, you can kick off with the presentation, and I will unshare my screen just as soon as I've worked out how. There you are.
Well, I'm very sorry, but it does seem that someone's decided to start drilling in my house exactly next door, well, in an apartment, and exactly when I've just started to do this. So I'm not sure how annoying this is going to be. My apologies if you hear drilling. Could you hear drilling just now?
No.
Okay, good. So the microphone's not picking it up. So as I mentioned, my name's Liam Campling. I'm a Professor of International Business and Development at Queen Mary. I'm starting the presentation. I'll also be handing over to Susan and then Tom. And what we want to do here is just give a snappy overview of what the Assembly was, how we recruited the participants, a summary of the process, and what the recommendations and kind of major outputs were. So I'll start off on what is the Citizens Assembly on Trade and Climate. A Citizens Assembly, to start off with, is really a kind of a group of regular people, randomly chosen, who have come together to talk about a challenging problem or issue affecting their community or country, to the particular population. They hear from experts, and then they make decisions or suggestions for the future. Now, the Citizens Assembly as a method, has been officially identified by the UK government as a form of deliberative research, and some important examples of prior Citizens Assembly include the UK Assembly on Climate Change, but perhaps most importantly is the Irish government's very extensive use of Citizens Assembly to deal with thorny public policy problems. So the project team consisted of Queen Mary University of London, where I was the lead, and the trade justice movement, as well as Mutual Gain. Tom, you've met. George Holt was kind of instrumental in the project as well, but she's currently on maternity leave. And Susan, you'll hear from in a minute, and she runs a deliberative democracy kind of organisation called Mutual Gain, and we'll come back to her in a minute. So this Citizens Assembly, I'm just going to pull all these up, really try to investigate how we can contribute to the improved effectiveness and enforceability of climate action. Now, the reason why we're looking at trade policy, is because trade policy commitments tend to be much more enforceable. They have teeth among the parties involved, whereas international environmental commitments tend not to be. They tend to be much more based upon best endeavours. A key example of which I played a kind of a minor role by participating in the World Trade Organization negotiations for an agreement on fishery subsidies, precisely tried to use trade policy in order to give environmental commitments a common problem that crosses borders, like fisheries or like climate change, try to be addressed by multiple kind of countries multilaterally in the WTO, and that's where I came into this kind of project. So the UK also, as probably many of you know, was quite opaque in terms of its kind of trade policy, kind of development, formation, very limited levels of consultation. And so therefore a citizens' assembly really kind of came out as being an important tool to try to kind of target the UK government as a potential leader in this area. So what did we draw from? But just very quickly, we did some significant research, which was led by George Holt, who I mentioned earlier. We reviewed all of the existing available surveys in the UK context, opinion polls, and various other forms of deliberative democracy that have been done on climate change, or that have been done on trade policy. They're listed here, and the kind of background research is on our project website. And all of this fed into our understanding of what kind of the gaps were. And so the kind of real starting point for this citizens' assembly is the question: how should the UK government respond to climate change through its trade policies? And to kind of finesse and develop that question, we had an advisory board, which consisted of a number of kind of experts from across the UK, representing quite different kind of areas, including the UK government, industry, civil society organisations, and trade unions. And they helped to finesse the question. For example, you see here was not the original question that went through this advisory board that provided oversight on that. The advisory board also provided significant kind of guidance on how participants should receive information, and also the types of information that was provided to them. The evidence committee also provided that oversight of that evidence and kind of advice. The evidence committee consisted of a group of academics, as well as the two UK statutory bodies of the Climate Change Committee and the Joint Nature Conservation Committee, which are two entities that support the UK government in thinking about biodiversity and climate change, respectively. So we had a very tight kind of organizational oversight kind of function in these two bodies, which we saw as being crucial to staying true to the kind of the method of citizens' assembly. And of course, Mutual Gain, who you'll hear more from in a second, played a key role here in kind of bringing in their own kind of understanding and insight, and making sure that we stayed true to the method, on which I'll pass over to you, Susan.
Thanks, Liam. So I'm just going to talk to you a bit about recruitment, because whenever you do any kind of engagement consultation, people say, yeah, well, who was involved in it? Were they real people? And one of the things I like about citizens' assemblies is we use something called sortition. And I'm very pleased to see that in the audience, we've got Tom Lord, Mr. Sortition Foundation. So if you've got any really difficult questions about recruitment, I will call on him to answer some of those. But if you can flick through the slides, Liam, that'd be great. So Tom sent out 21,000 invitations in order to get 60 participants. And we make sure that 20% of those invitations go to low-income households. In this case, they were all aged over 18 because it was done online for most of it, and then the final deliberations and recommendations phase were done in person, and that involved a residential stay at Queen Mary's University. So they were all 18 plus. Generally in an assembly, if you're an elected representative or you're a paid member of a political party, or if you're a council commissioning something like this, you wouldn't be able to participate in that because you've got other routes to decision making available to you. And we select people using a target audience. So we'll look at, okay, what does a national picture look like? And therefore, what percentage of this assembly do we need to have to reflect the wider UK population? So I'll show you in a minute, there's some charts there to show you what the target groups were, and just shows you visually how they matched up in the end. And we asked an attitudinal question just to see what people's view of climate change and trade was. So here's the charts. So you can see that first column there is the target population. So that's what it looks like. And then the next column is this is who responded. So of those 21,000 invites that went out, this is what we got back. So you can see there we got a few more who were non-binary. They're broadly similar percentages as you go through there. So that's who responded. And then you've got who we selected, which of course isn't always who finally participated. So we do an onboarding process once those are selected. So the Sortition Foundation take us up to selected, and then they hand it over to us, and we do the onboarding at mutual gain. And we get to speak to everybody, get to know a little bit about them, and get them prepared to participate. So that's the final cohort. The ones that actually completed is that final column. So you can see we went through the different ages and gender, and then occupation, what their view, their climate concern was, the attitudes to trade, and where in the country, in the UK, they came from. So you can see visually, just looking at the colours there, we did quite well. We got a really good reflection of the UK population. So when we start working with them, I'd say 59 completed. So one person pulled out near the end just because of other circumstances. So we had 59 that completed the assembly. As you can see, Sortition do the recruitment, Mutual Gain do the onboarding, and we do the design and the facilitation with the team. You can see there where they all came from. And because it was online, we wanted to make sure we were being very inclusive and made sure it didn't exclude people who weren't digitally connected. So when we do that onboarding, we find out what kind of device people have and if they need a device to work on. So we delivered 3 Chromebooks to people across different parts of the UK so that they could participate. And then we also look after people in terms of people who might need some extra support. So certainly people who might need assistance with their mental or physical health, and in terms of making sure they can participate fully when they're online and in person. So we did lots of support there for people.
So thank you, Susan. And I think that what was really important in the process of recruitment was precisely Mutual Gain's expertise in dealing with a very wide range of the population and making people feel at ease with the process, including actually training people on how to access and use a laptop and the software. So I think the Mutual Gain were absolutely fundamental to the process in this case. The process itself, just to give a quick snapshot of the actual what we call the field work. So this is the kind of evidence phase. Overall, the assembly consisted of 35 hours. So participants from across the country were engaged with us for 35 hours in the kind of introduction, the learning phase, and then on the 29th of June and the 30th of June, deliberation in person at Queen Mary University of London, and then until the final recommendations delivered in person, again at the university. So through this kind of the learning phase, we were lucky enough to have a large number of experts who kind of came forward and volunteered their time, including some world-leading kind of people and speakers, thinkers in trade and climate. And again, this was thanks to the advisory board and the evidence committee who helped us to kind of frame that. And in doing so, what we tried to do was to make sure we got a balance of different perspectives. And so there was quite a lot of conflicting views. There certainly wasn't agreement amongst the expertise and this experts, in the same way that there wasn't any agreement necessarily amongst, automatically, let's say, amongst the citizens' assembly members themselves. And so what we could see kind of here is the various steps of the process. The first kind of learning phases were all online, and you can see when they took place. And we looked at a number of kind of quite technical things, scaffolding the understanding, starting off by talking about trade in general, and then talking about climate in general, and then bringing the two together. And then thinking about the particular tools, trade policy tools that can be used. And we focused on standards, tariffs, subsidies, and public procurement, because they're the big hitters as kind of policy tools in this area. We then moved to the deliberation phase in person, where groups kind of prepared their own assessment criteria, and they drafted recommendations, which they then kind of debated. So the evidence phase, just to give you a quick kind of overview, you can see here a sequence of videos introducing trade policy and the relationship between trade and greenhouse gas emissions. And a 5-minute video would be shown, and then there would be a kind of a breakout group, and the participants would have the opportunity to discuss that in small groups, which were facilitated actively by the mutual gain facilitators, and then scribed by a series of kind of people working kind of behind the scenes on a software called Miro, which allowed the participants to see what was being kind of summarized as we went. So the whole process was as maximally transparent as possible. And here you can see kind of another just of a snapshot. All of these videos are available on our project website, which we'll show in a minute. But just to give an idea here on the question of at the border standards. So this is the standards that are applied on goods coming into the country. So we were kind of introduced to the kind of question of standards by one of the leading experts on trade and climate, Jennifer Hillman, and then a very particular take on how the UK could use environmental standards was advanced by WWF, the environmental NGO, and then a kind of counter view was advanced by someone from the Global South, from the Third World Network. And then similarly for a very technical area of carbon border adjustment mechanisms, which is a kind of EU policy that the UK have adapted. We have a kind of a technical overview, and then a discussion and debate between someone based in kind of Africa thinking about the kind of impacts on development, and someone based in the UK thinking about the environmental benefits of this tool. And so we were actively facilitating tensions in the trade policies tools that we were talking about, and the trade-offs. And so there was never a kind of a simple answer was being pushed. We wanted the participants to be very aware that, there's always going to be kind of winners and losers and kind of tensions and contradictions in any trade policy that seeks to solve a public policy problem like climate. And so for the deliberation phase that was facilitated by Susan and Mutual Gain, the groups kind of self-selected to focus on particular policy tools. You can see how they did that here. Procurement, subsidies, tariffs, and standards in a big room, and which risked kind of everyone falling into their own silo. But to kind of break that and to bridge that, we kind of used a kind of mirrored practices of kind of diplomacy, economic diplomacy at the WTO, by encouraging kind of diplomats to go from one table to the various other tables to discuss what they were drafting, how it related to another policy tool, and then in turn how they might kind of adjust that in order to ensure that there was some degree of consistency among the various policy tools, but also to test out ideas as they went. And we found that to be a really useful kind of process for strengthening the deliberation phase. The recommendations kind of phase is something that we'll move to Tom to talk about. Before I do, just very quickly, the Assembly themselves created their own assessment criteria for all of the recommendations. You can see these here. These are covered in the policy report, a summary of the Assembly process, which is available online. But the point is that Assembly members were very rigorous in their approach to thinking about what a policy tool addressing the climate crisis through trade should do, and for whom. And on that, I'll pass over to Tom.
Yeah, thanks. So Liam and Susan have described the process that we went through, the way that the research fieldwork kind of unfolded. I'm going to come in at the end and do the glamorous bit, which is talk about the recommendations that the Assembly arrived at, but also the conclusions that we as the project team drew about the overall question, which, just to remind you, is how should the UK government respond to climate change through its trade policies? So these are the kind of insights that we gained on that question specifically. As Liam said, we brought everyone together for a final weekend to do some kind of deliberation around what these recommendations might be, to do some bargaining and negotiation between different groups, and to arrive at a fantastic detailed set of recommendations covering everything from where the UK should be, what the UK should be doing with its subsidies, how the UK should be applying tariff policy, what the UK's public procurement rules should look like. As well as all those, and we can go into detail about what those recommendations look like, we also asked the Assembly to come up with one unifying statement that could be presented to essentially kind of act as the front page for what this assembly was all about, where they found common ground and where, the issues around which they really coalesced. That is now presented on the screen. I won't read all of it out, but just the key sections. We, the Assembly, believe that in the face of an existential climate crisis, it's imperative the UK harnesses all available trade policy tools to urgently mitigate its environmental impact. We believe that trade policy offers a practical solution to address the climate crisis, and we feel strongly that the UK government should use these recommendations to deliver material change. So it's a really clear-eyed, really unequivocal call for action that sees trade policy as presenting some answers to the climate crisis that we face. And we're really pleased that by the end of the project, the Assembly were able to agree on a statement that we thought was so extraordinarily powerful. Next slide, please, Liam. Yeah, so as Liam said, also there was this process for agreeing what the recommendations would be, and those 15 recommendations exist in the longer report, which I will include a link to. As well as those, we had a big kind of job of analysing the various data sources that we were left with at the end of this process. So we had the Assembly statement, we had the recommendations, we also had this huge wealth of transcripts and notes from the whole process. So we had transcripts of the discussions on Zoom, we had the notes that were written up by scribes, we also had the question and answers that were going on in Zoom itself, so in the Q&A bar, and we did a huge amount of analysis of those, both some with AI support, especially when it came to kind of picking out some of the key themes, and then we also kind of did contracted a researcher to support with some more kind of detailed analysis on those key themes, which are drawn out here. So these are the 6 insights that we as a project team took forward from this research. Number 1, trade policy is complex, climate policy is complex, and over the course of the Assembly, we very much saw participants grow in confidence at dealing with these complex issues. At the start, people were saying, this is too difficult, it's too confusing, how are we going to end up in a place where we can actually make some recommendations? By the end, there were lots of very detailed recommendations that belied a really close understanding of the subject matter. So from that, we understand that the complexity of the issue is not a reason to not consult citizens and to not try and get citizen input into policy making. The second really strong theme that came out is that greater urgency is needed in responding to the climate crisis. So people were frustrated and a bit aghast at the slowness with which the UK and other countries and international institutions were responding to the climate crisis. And they really wanted to see faster action. A third theme was about inherent trade-offs. So the Assembly were very quick in identifying that the various trade policy tools that we're talking about, from tariffs to subsidies to public procurement rules, possibly create winners and losers. There is no kind of fantastic trade policy that is going to solve every problem for every different interest group, for every different sector. Inevitably, these things result in winners and losers. And so you need some kind of mix of different tools. You need things to be designed in such a way that it supports those people who might occasionally lose out. And therefore, as we can see in the recommendations, the Assembly were very happy to say, if trade policy is the answer, we need a mix of all these various tools that we've discussed for that to be effective and successful. The fourth key theme we drew out was about international collaboration. We were looking for recommendations towards the UK government, but beyond that, Assembly members realised that the UK government alone does not hold the answer to global climate change, and really pushed the idea of international collaboration between governments, between businesses, and really pushed the importance of governments holding each other to account in an effective way around climate action. Fifth theme, around fairness, global fairness, and where the responsibility for tackling climate change should fall. So I was surprised and encouraged by the extent to which this was a really strong theme throughout the whole of the research. From the very start, Assembly members were very comfortable with the idea that the UK, as a developed country which has already undergone industrial transformation, should be shouldering a larger share of the responsibility for tackling global climate change, but also said, that it shouldn't be the poorer UK households that are bearing the brunt of those increasing costs. So understood that there were real considerations when it comes to climate justice that need to be borne in mind when going about designing a trade policy. And we were particularly those arguments were particularly made by uh, experts coming from a global south context who were able to talk about the their analysis of how trade policy should be designed. The sixth theme that we brought out is around the UK's industrial strategy. Assembly members were fairly confident in the idea that rather than just solely buying green goods and services from overseas, such as electric vehicles or solar panels, it would be prudent in terms of UK jobs, in terms of UK economic security in an uncertain world, for the UK to start developing some domestic green industries in areas where the UK is likely to be competitive, to reduce reliance on foreign supply chains. And that came through as a really clear theme as well. So those are the kind of 6 key insights that we gleaned from this huge wealth of data that we were left with at the end of the process. Next slide, please, Liam. And yeah, what we do now with all this, well, for the next half an hour, we discuss it with those people on the call, and we'd be very happy to hear people's questions and insights. And please start putting them in the chat if you've got questions. I wanted to walk you through just the resources that we've got out at the moment. So we have, as Liam referenced at the start of the meeting, a project website. That is a sub-website of the Queen Mary website, and that includes 2 key published resources. One, longer report on this assembly. It's about 44 pages. It goes into a lot of depth about what was covered in different sessions and includes the full unedited recommendations, 15 of them. And then there's a policy brief as well, which is more like 12 pages, intended for a more casual audience, and includes the summary of what we did. We've sent that to a large number of MPs and members of the House of Lords, as well as sharing it with various civil servants in the various kind of relevant departments on energy, on business, and on foreign affairs. There's also links in that sub-website to 2 videos, the one that I failed to play at the start of this meeting, and then a longer one of about 6 minutes where you can hear in a bit more depth from the various assembly members, which I'd urge people to watch because it really gives a good sense of the kind of mood in the room. And yeah, the kind of complexities and ultimate kind of energizing nature of trying to have these discussions. In terms of our other follow-up, before Christmas, we had a launch event in the Houses of Parliament. It was very well attended, including by parliamentarians who asked questions that really kind of showed their level of interest in this, as well as civil society members, members of the Assembly as well. We're holding this event. Liam and I have spoken to various civil servants, including last week a meeting with about 30 civil servants from the Department of Business and Trade and also from the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero. So we're getting a lot of interest in this from policymakers who I think understandably really feel like these insights are kind of helpful and supportive to their own work. And we're delighted to have so many opportunities to talk about it. So please, yeah, look at those resources in your own time. And I think that might be us done. Fantastic. Yeah, so I hope that has been a useful introductory presentation. And now we have the opportunity to kind of discuss what's been presented, to discuss the findings, to discuss the implications of what we've said. I'm just looking at the chat, and thanks for sharing the link, Susan. So some
Maddie's
great
got,
questions from Maddie. Yeah.
yeah.
And Maddie, do you want to unmute yourself and kind of ask that question yourself?
Hi, yeah, can do.
Thanks.
I was quite interested in your point that you had in that last slide around the making sure that fairness is a key consideration, and that poorer households wouldn't be kind of taking the brunt of the impacts. I assume that kind of relates to the fact that a lot of these levers that you might be putting in place would increase prices, and poorer households would be more affected by that. But yeah, I was just wondering if they had any sort of practical thoughts around how that could be achieved, or was it just a kind of guiding principle that they were saying should be considered somehow?
Thanks. Liam, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, the assembly, there's quite a few assembly members here as well. So if someone would like to speak from the assembly itself, but trying to summarize on behalf of the assembly members, things like subsidies, for example, were discussed at length, and there was some concern around the current kind of range of fossil subsidies going to fossil fuel producers and consumption. And one of the things that was discussed was how to redistribute some of that subsidy to the poorer households who may be hit by higher costs of energy transitions, for example. And so there was a discussion of the distributional kind of process of policy, and that's one example. There were many though, and I'm trying to avoid going into too much detail. Some of these discussions, Maddie, are actually in the report itself, and what we did was provide the full long report, which of course most people won't read, but in the annex there are summaries of the discussions, all anonymized, of course, which really give a sense of some of the detail of what was discussed, and also the points of contestation, kind of agreement, disagreement, convergence, and divergence in the room. And one of the big things that we started off with in the discussions was costs to households. And of course, that's an entirely reasonable concern given the cost of living crisis that is experienced by most people, the majority of people in the UK, but not a significant minority, right? And so when we then kind of got into the question of cost, we then started thinking about future costs of not doing anything, for example, and kind of trying to play them against each other. This wasn't a quantitative exercise, of course, it was a qualitative one, and one based upon kind of deliberation and discussion, but certainly this kind of question of fairness played a central role in thinking about distributional impacts of any trade policy tool that was used to combat climate change.
It's worth saying, Maddie, there are people on the call who were in the assembly as assembly members, so feel free if you can think of any of the things that you were talking about and you want to share with Maddie on the call. It's also worth noting we were right at the general election time, weren't we? So there was lots of politics going on too, which was sort of referring to the notion of fairness with communities.
We have now
open anything? Come on, you weren't shy in the assembly.
Hello. Just I was thinking through what you said about the government, change of government. One government's in, they have their own way of doing things. Another one comes in and they have their way of doing things, which would make you feel maybe that, is this going to be implemented? And then somebody else change their mind. This needs to be some sort of a body which will bring forward to the government of the day what should happen, really, rather than one government change. The same thing's happening in America. The new president comes in next week and he's going to change climate change things there. So, I mean, we talk about fairness. to be fair, we can't start off a project and then all of a sudden it's changed halfway through. So that's just the point that I would make on this one.
Well said, Brian, that continuity of the thinking, the resources, the recommendations, all the hard work that went into it needs to be non-political in terms of party political. Yeah. And I think that's promising in many ways because, as Tom said, they met with 30 civil servants recently. So that's promising that it's not party political. Can you share anything about that, Tom or Liam, putting you on the spot there? But
I mean, we gave them the same presentation that we just delivered over the last half an hour. And yeah, I think as I said, there's like a huge amount of interest in these kinds of bits of research because they don't come along every day. There's obviously a huge amount of work and resources gone into making them happen. And if you're working in a trade related role or a climate change related role, I think naturally it's like there's a huge relevance to your role. So people are really interested uh, in the findings and in kind of like understanding um, some of the tone of the conversation. What we obviously don't have is like a clear way forward in terms of like what government will now do. That is not in the gift of a lot of people we're talking to, and separately we're trying to make sure that this report is in front of the relevant ministers and relevant kind of influential MPs. Which is obviously a much harder role to do than just having a conversation with civil servants. So that's kind of ongoing. We hope to be able to kind of reflect back in a few months in terms of where those conversations have led to.
It's also worth saying when we launched it in Parliament before Christmas, the MPs that came along to that were across the parties, weren't they? I think we had someone from every party represented there who were all really interested and wanted to see the continuity of this and to see where it goes to make sure that it didn't get lost anywhere. So that was sort of irrespective of their party, wasn't it, if I remember rightly? Some of the people in the audience, and then we were hosted by an MP as well. So yeah, looks quite promising.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm aware we've got a large number of kind of people on the call who are possibly hearing about this for the first time, or possibly were expert evidence givers earlier on in the process and haven't had the opportunity to kind of check in. So I want to make sure there's plenty of opportunity for people to ask questions if you've got any. So yeah, now's your time to throw up a hand, and either we'll be able to answer, or members of the assembly who are on the call might be able to throw in their thoughts as well. Yeah, Kira, go for it.
Thank you. And thanks very much for the presentation. I suppose I was just wondering, given what you said about the recommendations themselves, and it not being clear yet exactly how much they will be implemented by the current government, what about the mechanism of the Citizens' Assembly? Are there lessons in terms of participation and how government should be doing things? Maybe what select committees should be doing, maybe what consultations should be doing in the future, that maybe come out from this separately to trade policy. And are there any recommendations that people would see as key there in terms of participation? And have you had any feedback on the concept of the Citizens' Assembly?
Happy to do an initial response to that. So the answer is definitely we're getting more and more interest in deliberation, and certainly dialogue and then deliberation. Sometimes people don't distinguish between the two when they're asking for more talk, more opportunities to talk about complex issues, I think. So I think that's definitely that was happening anyway, but I think that the more you do these things with tricky issues like trade and climate change coming together, then I think the more that people will accept that it is not beyond our ability as citizens to be able to get our head around the same things that professionals might get their heads around and come to reasonable responses for that. I think it's probably good. I'm not going to put him on the spot here, so I hope he's still in the room, is to perhaps turn to Tom on that. So the Sortition Foundation, this is their kind of raison d'etre, if you like. So their reason for being here is to bring more of this into decision making. So Tom, I don't know if you want to say something from your perspective about using this in a democracy, if you're there. Is he still there?
He may have, popped up for a moment. So
okay, so yeah, more people interested. And I think I'll definitely ask the citizens. So in terms of feedback, we got amazing feedback from the group, and one of the things that really resonated with me at the end, and the people that were in the assembly on the call may remember this, but there was quite a few, I think, in the assembly who didn't come feeling like this was going to be a great thing. They came maybe to test it, see what it was like. Maybe they had particular views which they didn't agree with others on. And so it's fair to say there was a good amount of debate in the small groups. And I remember one of the assembly members coming up to me at the end of the session, giving me a high five and saying to me, "You've restored my faith in humanity." Because think about it, Sue. If you just listen to the politics that we get and the news that we get, you'd think it's useful for them to pitch us against each other. And yet here we are, people with very different positions, very different backgrounds, and we can all come to a recommendation without shifting our position. So it was more about them sort of, look, I still believe in all of this, but you know what? Yeah, we can. We don't have to be completely opposite and polarised in our views. We can bring our experiences together and come up with reasonable recommendations that will benefit the whole country. So we've got sort of more detailed feedback that will be in the report from them. But that was my big takeaway, that, that somebody who thought it was going to be a load of rubbish actually thought it was really good and was impressed by the humanity in that. And you get that all the time. Any assembly I run, you got people who leave thinking, actually, that was more genuine, that was better than I thought it was going to be. Because I think trust levels in any decision-making process are quite low at the moment, and this restores a bit of faith in bringing people together to make shared decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. And the two things we've really taken out of this from the perspective of the trade justice movement are, one, the settled, deliberated on view of UK citizens is that the UK should be doing more with its trade policy to tackle climate change. And that's the kind of issue-based thematic one. And the second is that absolutely an engaged group of citizens drawn on a representative basis absolutely can help politicians navigate these otherwise very tricky policy discussions. And we hope that that also kind of provides a bit of cover for a politician if they want to try and make it a kind of a decision that they worry might be unpopular, or roll out a policy that might be a bit more ambitious than they think some people might be ready for. If they've got the behind them some idea of what the settled view of UK citizens is, then that creates a bit of confidence and a bit more impetus to actually do some stuff that might mean that we move a bit more quickly on these issues than perhaps the political establishment would be happy to. Any more questions from the audience?
Can I see Tom? I don't know if Tom's in there. I thought I saw him, but did he just come back in?
I did come back in. Sorry, someone rang me about a piece of work that we're working on just in the middle of this call, and I had to duck out. But
I
I'm
was
here
calling
again.
you in because the question was, do you think decision makers should do more of this, or is there an interest in people doing more of this? And I thought, well, I really ought to probably call to you because that is your reason for being in the Sortition Foundation. So I don't know if you wanted to share any thoughts.
I mean, yeah, I don't know that I'm going to say something really unexpected, but yes, absolutely. We think this, this should absolutely be the way that we make important decisions. This is the most legitimate form of decision making that we can imagine. we've got a diverse representative group. We've given them time. They are not the usual suspects. They've been selected in a fair, transparent way. They've been given all the information. They've had time to think about it, and what they've come out with is the best form of decision that we can imagine. So yes, that is why we exist as an organisation. So it's probably what we would say, but it is what we say, because that is why we exist.
Are you hearing anything from the sort of democratic circles that there might be any more interest in doing more of these?
I mean, it's interesting to see what's happening at the moment with, say, the NHS commissioning so many deliberative consultations in the last year on, say, data sharing or on future policy. I mean, I think bits of government and bits of the state will pick up this approach in different ways. And I think this approach here, this kind of, I think this is a really pioneering approach. You've put together as a kind of third sector intervention, this kind of deliberative process, which is a more novel approach, and it's one that's being explored within the sector. And I think it's super valuable to have this kind of more civil society initiated outside of government to campaign for outcomes and so on.
For people who don't really know what the third sector is, that's the sort of the non-government. Quite often assemblies are commissioned by councils or governments or governmental bodies, but because this was a university and a trade justice movement of organisations, one of the challenges is around that is they themselves don't have decision-making power, and they have to use the research in order to access power. And so that is, I think, as Tom said, a much more interesting a way of thinking about how society asks for conversations about things.
I mean, if I can finish that, I mean, I think we're on the baby slopes of experimenting with this novel approach, and I think every initiative that we see in the UK and elsewhere is just a really valuable contribution to that. And I imagine that in 5 or 10 years' time, we'll be thinking a lot differently about how we use these, and I think we will see these kind of approaches becoming a lot more prevalent, and I hope so, and I certainly see that, and that's what I'm working on. So I think it's exciting to be part of this very, very necessary pioneering work in how we think about democracy.
Thanks, Tom.
Great, thanks very much for your contribution, Tom. I think we've got opportunity for a couple more questions, and one's from Ruth and her colleagues.
Hi Tom, hi everyone. Thanks for the presentations. I've been involved in the assembly kind of along the whole journey, so it's great to be here at the end and seeing how it's all come out. So I've got a question from Fiona, but she's at the end of the room, so I'm going to read it out. The question is, has a citizens' assembly been used to review a policy decision and its implementation? And kind of going with that, to what extent were you able to discern whether people's experiences of policy and implementation were informing what they were saying in the assembly? So did that come up? So just because there is a difference of kind of imagining future policy that might not already exist, and kind of reviewing what you've already experienced. Thanks.
I think, Susan, if you're able to answer that, I think you're best positioned.
I don't know all the assemblies, obviously, and actually Tom might have a better idea of more of them, because mainly people will go to him to recruit for them. But I am doing one at the moment, which is about policy implementation, actually, and it's been commissioned to look at the best way in which to implement new transport and travel plans across an area. So I think people are feeling like they could be really useful practically. And I'm pretty sure, given travel and transport can be quite controversial, I'm pretty sure that when that assembly comes together, they haven't been recruited, they're in recruitment at the moment. But I'm fairly sure when they do come together, there'll be lots of discussion there about, can we review this policy, And we've been doing some of that conversation in the scoping phase. On the one hand, yes, we want to capture what people would do in terms of changing that policy. And on the other hand, you want to make sure it's very practical and you can embed the policy in a fair way. So I guess if you ask me that question, it will be fresh in my mind in a couple of months' time, no doubt.
May I just add just briefly as well, because the content of the Citizens Assembly on Trade and Climate covered both policy and practice, so actual policies that are actually existing and have been implemented, and we talked about them, and policy in principle, so what one might do or might not do, but crucial to kind of all of that was kind of scaffolding it or concretizing it in particular cases, so electric vehicles or food or heating the home and so on. And that kind of helped to bring it to life and stop it from being just an abstraction, I think.
It's also, I don't know whether this is the right place to say it or not. Maybe that shows my learning in that process as well. But there was out of that came a statement about ISDS, didn't it? Which wasn't in the assembly. It wasn't a conversation that was scheduled to go in, but one of the speakers mentioned it and the assembly wanted to talk about it, and there ended up a recommendation about that, didn't there?
Yeah, so that's a reference to a particular, as people on this call may know, element of trade and investment agreements or investor-state dispute settlement that was very much seized upon when it was mentioned in passing by one of the speakers as a kind of particularly notable, outrageous, worrisome aspect of the UK trade and investment policy. And yeah, Assembly members included it as one of the major recommendations. I think it's included in the wording of the second recommendation that came out in the report. So that demonstrates that it wasn't just the learning and the kind of structure wasn't driven entirely by us. Inevitably, it had to be kind of flexible and open to these kind of changes organically throughout the process. We've got 2 more minutes, so I think one more question if anyone's got one. This is your opportunity to throw up a hand.
Or if there's any assembly members there that want to just share what it felt like for you, for others to get a sense of what it was like.
All right, well,
so, won't you?
in the absence of volunteers, I think we'll bring this meeting to an end. Fantastic to see everyone. Thanks very much for taking the time to attend. And yeah, I hope that you all enjoy reading the reports that we've come out with and watching the videos. And please feel free to share them with anyone you know who might be interested, whether they're the Prime Minister, policymakers, or just friends and family. Yeah, always very happy to see these things shared and to kind of see what comes out of it. And if you want to ask any follow-up questions that occur to you on the stairs on your way out of the office, then we are here to be responded to be contacted. So yeah, please get in touch. Thanks very much, everyone. Have a great rest of the day.
Bye.
Bye, everyone. Thanks for coming.
Do we want to stop recording?